Thank you very much for having me here. I came up on a train from Cornwall, and I can't help but think, looking at Kevin's background, that he's gone on holiday to Cornwall. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. A question I'm often asked is whether the organisation I work for has departed from its core business of responding to natural disasters. This question is prompted by the fact that year upon year, the majority of households we support were principally made homeless by conflict-related displacement. And just to be absolutely clear, I'm going to skirt over the contentious nature of that slightly simplistic statement. But such questions about our raison d'etre have caused me to ponder what it is about the naturalness of a natural disaster that appeals to some people when they're considering their charitable giving. My conclusion is that it may be the apolitical and mutual associations of a natural disaster that can be most compelling. Natural disasters are sometimes perceived to be non-discriminatory and can affect all those caught in their path equally. Therefore, giving is not a decision embedded in politics. It's simply about responding to those in need, following events that are often unpredictable and outside our sphere of influence. This theory is largely based on observation and some reflection, but it's a theory which I'm going to develop during this presentation. ShelterBox follows in the footsteps of other humanitarian organisations by removing natural disaster from its lexicon. And this shift in brand language offers me an opportunity to reflect on why we might have asserted the naturalness of disaster in our previous communications. Recognising that ShelterBox is still on a journey, constantly seeking to help to improve how we represent crisis-affected people, I also benefit from seeing the road that lies ahead of us. So this presentation isn't about what we do, it's about what we must do better. To answer, sorry, could I move on to the next slide? Thank you. To answer the question for why the term natural disaster has been beneficial to some people throughout history, I have reflected on what organisations working in humanitarian response may gain from using this language. My supposition is that terminology associated with a natural disaster serves two functions. Firstly, the description of a disaster as natural simplifies the problem statement. To state that something is of nature suggests there's very little we can do to respond to the cause, although we can respond to the symptoms. Perhaps there is a concern that if we peel back the onion skin of complexity, this may inadvertently reveal an organisation's offering to be little more than a sticking plaster solution. Secondly, an exploration into the causality of disaster would require us to look critically at the social, economic, and political drivers of vulnerability. Not only do we run the risk of alienating the very governments that we are committed to supporting, and by proxy are reliant upon for access, but such analysis can hold up a mirror to the consumer choices and political leanings of our supporters. While some audiences may be more accepting of the concept that disasters can be linked to the historical and present-day decisions of those in developed economies, there is a danger that this more politicised form of messaging would cause others to disengage. Whilst largely conjecture, there are parallels to be drawn between the comments I'm making here and the observation of Bankoff in his paper on vulnerability as a Western discourse. Here, Bankoff observes that the term natural disaster has enabled governments to talk about disease, poverty, the environment, and disaster as four unrelated issues that need not be tackled concurrently and can be responded to through typically technocratic solutions. By talking about natural disasters, are we isolating the problem and presenting the side of it that speaks best to the solution that we offer? Next slide, please. There is one area where non-governmental organisations have pivoted around a more complex portrayal of disasters. Hazard events and humanitarian crisis more broadly are now commonly linked to anthropogenic climate change in a way that hasn't been seen before. Surely then, this is disaster socially constructed. In 2020, Super Cyclone Amphan damaged 2.9 million homes in the West Bengal region of India. This was the strongest storm to affect the Ganges Delta since the Odisha cyclone in 1999. One of the worst affected areas was the Sundarbans, a low-lying archipelago of islands stretching north across the Bay of Bengal. In the new era of climate change acknowledgement, many of those commentating on the event confidently linked Cyclone Umpan to the climate crisis. Next slide, please. In the article of Pandemics and Storms published on the American Ethnographic Society website, two researchers that had worked extensively in the Sundarbans provided a more critical portrayal of cause and effect. The authors present some useful background information, explaining why certain islands on the Sundarbans were first inhabited under colonial rule as part of an unwavering quest for income generation. In this account, COVID-19 is described not simply as the threat to which those who have survived the cyclone now face, but as something which led to a raft of government restrictions that disproportionately disadvantaged those from the informal and agricultural sectors. Few social protections were offered to those outside the 10% of the population who work in India's formal sector. Many migrants of the Sundarbans engaged in work in cities including Calcutta found themselves without work and at very short notice. And despite the challenges associated with homeward travel in a country locked down, this led to large populations of people trying to return to the communities that they'd left many years ago. And many of those who had remained in the Sundarbans but were also engaged in the informal sector had also been without work since the beginning of lockdown. Next slide, please. According to this account, the disaster that followed in the wake of Cyclone Umpan cannot be viewed independently from the government response to COVID-19 and the, quote, callous indifference towards India's unfortunate and destitute. But this account is not a portrayal of helplessness, showcasing the balance that can be struck between critical analysis and dignified representation. Vulnerability is not a product of the self, of personal or even protected characteristics to which vulnerability can be ascribed. It is created by the state and the decisions that they make. And rather paradoxically, perhaps, resilience is not described as the antonym to vulnerability, as so often we see it, but as a strength that is actually generated by it. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We know from insights and supporter profiling that climate change is an issue that resonates strongly with supporter groups. In 2006, when I was studying for an MSc in climate change, publicly at least, it was still a much contested subject. Whether the climate was changing as a result of human activity, or if it was changing at all, was a highly charged political debate. As for the notion of attribution, whereby singular, high-profile weather events could be positively connected to a changing climate, this was an absolute minefield where few dared to tread. Rolling forward 15 years, it's far easier for lines to be drawn between a large hurricane or typhoon and the climate crisis without any real need to provide hard evidence. To some extent, seeing where we've come from, this change in public attitude is to be welcomed if we've got any hope of meaningfully cutting our emissions. But perhaps we're turning climate change into the latest external and, dare I say, apolitical threat. Whilst we recognise that it's human activity that's forcing the climate, when we describe disaster, we're still presenting a hazard that is of nature and not talking about how society positions itself with regards to nature. Taking the words of Terry Cannon out of context and applying them to this discussion, and I apologise for this, to say that a disaster was the result of climate change is merely a post hoc accommodation with the banal and obvious. We find that the causes are not properly discussed, just in case that might require a radical shift in the way that assets and wealth are owned and controlled in the world. When we as humanitarian and development actors frame a disaster within the context of the climate crisis, do we do this because we know it lands well with audiences? Or are we doing it because we want to draw awareness to something else that requires people's attention and deserves response? If it's the latter, then should we not describe the disaster within the broader picture of inequity and injustice in which it's played out? This wouldn't require us to omit climate change from the narrative, but rather would enable us to speak with clarity about how climate change affects people differently. Let's not treat climate change as the new natural disaster, something that is external to society, but describe it as something that is intrinsically social, political, and economic, not just in terms of what is driving the climate crisis, but how and why society positions itself. That means that some people will feel the impact of climate change more significantly than others. And this vulnerability should not be described as something which could be attributed to personal characteristics. We should be framing it within the context of the states and structures of governance that give rise to vulnerability. I close this presentation with a question. As we look to pivot our actions and our words to meet the needs of a changing climate, how can we as humanitarian organisations better confront the causality of disaster in our communications? Because this is not simply a matter of semantics, this is about representation. Thank you.